Welcome to Shelf Builders Podcast. I'm Dustin Porta. This is a podcast where we help readers get to know authors by talking about their bookshelves. And before I introduce our guest, I just wanted to make a quick announcement. We now have a Shelf Builders Discord, and there will be a link to it in the show notes if you want to find some new authors, new books, or comment on the show. Now let's get started. Daniel Maidman, welcome to Shelf Builders Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks so much for having. Good. How are you?
Good. So I brought you on to talk about your bookshelf, but I want you to briefly introduce yourself and your book.
Sounds good. My name's Daniel Maidman. I am a SPIFBO semifinalist. My book was the Exile of Zanzibar, which is epic fantasy, not very much magic. And until recently, I've had a really hard time figuring out how to describe it. But I hung out with a friend of mine a couple days ago who helpfully said, your book is a fish out of water story, which presents an intimate personal portrait of growth and transformation set against a sweeping historical backdrop of the transformation of a whole society. And I was like, that actually is what my book is about. Thank you for telling me. I couldn't figure that out.
That's great.
So. Yeah, I love that. So that's what my book's about.
I wish someone would do that for me.
I'll ask her if she'll read your book.
Excellent. So you're a semifinalist, and you said you were a semifinalist. Does that mean, like me, you've sadly been cut?
I have sadly been cut, but I was cut for Daughter of the Beast, which looks fantastic. So I've got nothing to feel bad about on that front.
Great thing about this contest is even if you get cut, you usually have some nice things said about your book before it goes.
Yeah, the judges have been really generous. So it's really nice. And I'm really glad I got this far this time, because I don't know if I'm ever going to have another first book in a fantasy series. So this was my one shot.
Do you have big plans to continue the series that this book is set in, or you just go in another direction entirely?
No, this is like book 1 of 7, so I expect to be writing it more or less the rest of my life. And I'm really happy about that. I'll never have writer's block again, because I know what I'm doing.
Congratulations on having it all planned out.
Yeah.
Let's start with a tour of your bookshelf. I wanted to ask you, what sort of a bookshelf do you keep, and what books are front and center on your bookshelf right now?
Okay, I'm in front of 2 of my bookcases. I've got a lot of bookcases. So I chose to sit in front of science fiction and fantasy over here, and literature over there. The bottom shelves have art books, and the bookcases we don't have are science fiction, art and art theory, poetry, plays, things I'm in, signed copies of things. And then there's a bunch of bookcases downstairs as well. I love being surrounded by books. So I am immoderate in the number of books I have around.
So you're an artist as well.
Yeah.
When you say things you're in, are you talking about art books, or are you also in some science fiction and fantasy compilations?
Let's see. These are mostly art magazines, art books, and a couple books that I wrote essays for. It looks like, yeah, and some books on art instruction that have some of my work in them.
Very cool.
Mostly art, yeah.
Well, one of my questions is usually, how do you organize bits? You've kind of answered it already. Is it strictly by genre?
It's mostly by genre, and then alphabetized within that with a certain amount of irregularity based on things not fitting on shelves. You've got your tall shelves and your short shelves, and it doesn't always match up with the alphabet.
So far, most everyone I've talked to has had a very strict organizational system, which surprises me. I thought more authors would just sort of go by vibe, but everyone's very organized.
No. Oh, I've got a couple downstairs that are also the research level, and that's gotten a little bit sloppy over time because there's so many different topics. So there's a shelf that's all Greek and Roman military history, and another shelf that's all like history of railroads and things like that. That's all over the place. It's gotten all mixed up together over time.
How long have you had these books? Is this like a continuation of your childhood collection, or is this something that started when you bought the home?
No. These are my two first science fiction books, and I got this book because I had like seen pictures from the movie, and then I was like, I really like this
read the
author.
titles on those for the people who are on the audio only version.
Oh yeah, sure. So my first science fiction book was The Black Hole by Alan Dean Foster, and I read it and I was like, I really like this writing. So I went back to the used bookstore and got the other book of his they had, which was Nor Crystal Tears, which also started my lifelong admiration for Michael Whelan's cover paintings. And I've got a couple books of his paintings now as well. So yeah, that's where it all started for me.
I'm not familiar with Foster, but I think I am familiar with Whelan.
Yeah, he's great. I think I'm almost sure that Alan Dean Foster ghost wrote the novelization of Star Wars. But I think that there was like a big to-do with Disney and SIFLA a few years ago regarding royalties from that. But he's written like 60 or 70. Yeah. He's written 60 or 70 books, I think. Just a lifelong science fiction writer, and I read like 40 or 50 of them when I was a kid. So he's still out there writing.
I think the first science fiction I read was Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End.
Okay.
It would have been like 9th grade, and it was a slim book, but you were on a point system, so they awarded a certain number of reading points for the complexity. So I picked the smaller, more complex books so I could get more points quicker.
I've only read that one relatively recently.
Really?
That's a freaky book. Yeah.
Yeah, his stuff can be freaky. Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes you feel weird, especially when you're a teenager.
Yeah. His writing is so flat and uninflected, and then sometimes he has like utterly trippy ideas in it. And so it's like somebody, somebody who comes across as completely calm and lucid, and then you like come across this stuff and you're like, you're having no emotional response as a writer to this utterly bizarre material that you're writing. So he's a really weird writer.
Well, a lot of the stories he writes are about these unfeeling aliens or these inhuman energy beings having transcendent experiences or longing for transcendent experiences. So maybe there's something there, something personality. Show us some more. You said you had some more childhood books. Any other cool covers?
Yeah, I've got my first Stanislaw Lem novel, Memoirs Found in a Bathtub, which
I love that cover too.
Isn't that a great cover?
It's like a checker. It's like a bathtub with skulls and sand and a scroll within it, in front of a checkerboard pattern.
It's tough to make out. It's the premise of this book is, and I read this when I was 13, so I may have it a little bit off, but this agent who has been assigned to a large intelligence agency called the Building. And everything about it is so secretive that he can't actually find his office or his assignment or his superior officer. And he wanders the building for like a really long time, trying to find any meaning at all inside of it. And he gradually pieces together that the building's nemesis, which is called the anti-building, may have so thoroughly infiltrated it that the building and the anti-building have reversed places.
What's the title of the book again?
It's Memoirs Found in a Bathtub.
I'm writing that down.
And it's the same.
Going on my list.
He wrote Solaris. And he's fantastic. He was a very strange Polish science fiction writer. So he had a big influence on me as well.
In addition to books and art books, do you have any trinkets or other tchotchkes that you keep on your bookshelf? We're doing the physical tour right now.
I would have to take it downstairs. I have some weird action figures that I don't even actually know what they are. I just got them because they looked cool.
It looks very serious and well ordered behind you right now.
Oh yeah, well, it's at other times they're books stacked on top of books. I the bookcases that are more hidden away are the ones that have toys in front of the books as well. But like when I say downstairs, I mean the basement. Like we have work areas in the basement and a lot of books. I've got a number of C-3POs and several different R2D2s. Remember how they changed the R2D2 action figure design? So I've got all the R2D2s.
How did they change
and
it?
a Venus
I
de
don't remember
Milo.
that.
Oh, okay. So if you were getting like an R2D2 action figure in like the 80s or the 70s, I guess, it didn't really look like R2D2. And so like all the lights and things on the dome were in the wrong spots, and all the detailing on the cylinder was just a sticker. And around the time that I guess they released the prequels, they came out with like a completely accurate R2D2 action figure where the dome was correctly sculpted and all of the detailing on the cylinder was modeled into the plastic. And it was like almost disappointing because you had to make believe with the bad R2D2 all those years, and then they did like a good one. You're like, well, this just looks like him.
Because you're writing fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
I want to bring you back to fantasy a little bit. What fantasy is on your shelf right now?
Let me check.
Or I could also
right.
ask, what fantasy have you read recently?
Oh, I'm reading Tigana right now, which is really amazing. Guy Gavriel Kay.
Guy Gavriel Kay. Brandon Sanderson talks that up a lot. I think that's one of his favorite books. That's why I know of it. Is that the one that's like the Napoleonic Wars but with dragons?
No, that's the Temeraire books.
That's Temeraire.
Tigana is set in like fantasy Renaissance Italy after it's been conquered by two different competing wizards who are quite evil.
Okay.
And it's about a local uprising against them. And a friend of mine told me it was a comp for my books. So I started reading it, and I realized what a compliment that was because it's an amazingly beautiful book. So I'm partway through that, and and for audiobook, I'm listening to Words of Radiance right now, which is the second Stormlight Chronicle book. It's a long time to get going, but they're pretty good once stuff happens.
That's what I hear. I hear if you're gonna read Sanderson, go with the Stormlight Archive first.
I read Mistborn, which I liked pretty well.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, but Stormlight is really you can tell his heart's really in it.
Is that what you're reading right now, or is there stuff outside the fantasy genre that you've been reading lately as well?
On ebook, I'm reading The Never-Ending End of the World, which it was published this year. That's a sort of like a physics-driven apocalypse book where this is interesting. So the premise in this thing is that there was some kind of a failed super collider experiment, and it has resulted in most of the world shattering into very short time loops. And a very few people were not affected by it. So they're making their way through this landscape of like other people repeating themselves in like endless small solitary loops. And reading it, I realized that like there's a sort of like a very tiny genre of these physics-driven apocalypse stories where most of humanity disappears. So the other one that it reminds me of is Vanishing Point, which I think the author on that is Michaela Rossner. I could be wrong, but it's also set in a largely depopulated world after some kind of physics disaster at the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. And then the 1985 science fiction film The Quiet Earth, which I think is based on a story, but I haven't read that story. But it's another thing where like most of humanity has disappeared, and like there are few people wandering around this empty world.
Does it feel? Do you get like a really highbrow vibe from this, or like a really lowbrow vibe from this? I feel like it could swing wildly into super campy or super like this is literary fiction.
I guess generally both. I mean, there no. The Quiet Earth is the one, even though it's a movie, I think is the one that has the most literary pretensions. It's kind of a gripping idea of just most of humanity having disappeared, and creepy and mysterious, and like so you get a whole bunch of resonance out of it. And all three of those are written by authors who really know how to squeeze all of that creepiness out of it. So I guess more of a lowbrow vibe, but there's something about the premise that just really grabs me.
There's really, the line's so blurred, you know. So, some of the best writers, the highbrow and lowbrow is such a weird terminology to use, because, you know, some of the best writers I know are writing stuff that would be considered pulp or chaff or lowbrow. And I've read plenty of stuff that's supposed to be very good, and it wasn't very good. But it seems like you're kind of an omnivore like I am. You read everything.
I mean, I mostly I like things that you would call like trashy, and I like things that you would call literature. I don't really like above average. Sort of like the entire literary fiction zone bothers me quite a bit. Like, I feel like if you're going to, I feel like they deny themselves the pleasures of like genre fan service without really having the imagination or insight to hit the pinnacles of great writing. So I don't see the point. Like, it's just not fun. That's me.
I was talking with W.D. Kilpack III for my first episode on here, and he was talking about we were talking about myth and, you know, like old Greek mythology, Roman mythology. I feel like that's something that, you know, even literary fiction will sort of mine that for theme, without acknowledging that that was the popular fiction at the time and might have more in common with some of the tropes that we as fantasy writers are dealing with, that they kind of throw out with the bathwater. One thing that I try and ask everyone before we start talking about their books is, can you pick one book that you particularly like, that you either read recently or you keep going back to, or is an old favorite? And can you give us an impromptu review of it or an impromptu synopsis? Generally, the less prepared you are, the better.
Fantastic.
Yes, I like watching people struggle to remember their favorite book and describe it to me.
I mean, I have a lot of books that I would think of as favorite books, but the more time passes,
whatever you think will be fun.
Okay, the Baroque Cycle, Neil Stephenson. I think that his ambition to write a very big story was most successful with that trilogy. And there's so much fun and adventure, and yet the depiction of the modern world in terms of science and finance emerging out of the Middle Ages is so expertly done and beautifully handled, and really demands a canvas as big as that book, and has a really great ending, which he's complained that people don't like his endings, and I don't like his endings, but this one has a great ending. It's such an incredibly satisfying book. So I definitely recommend the Baroque Cycle for anyone up for like 3,000 pages of Neil Stephenson.
Awesome.
Fantastic book.
Well, before we end the book, or before we end the podcast, I want to talk a bit about your books.
Okay.
Do you ever think about what your book's going to look like on a shelf? And do you ever think about how it's going to look like in like a folio or like a volume of 3? Do you think about maybe combining them into like a hardbound multi-volume collection someday?
I have not given sufficient thought to how the spines will all look physically beside one another, which is something that maybe I should have done more of before publishing the first one. But I got the cover painting for the first one is by a guy named I'm showing this for those listening to the podcast. It's by a painter named Billy Norby, who I'm friends with and who's just marvelous. And he does a lot of fantasy and science fiction illustrations. So I commissioned an oil painting for the cover. Like, I did interior illustrations, but I don't think that I'm technically qualified to do fantasy painting for the cover of a book. So I asked him to do it, and I loved the job that he did. But I think the spine's cool, but I haven't really planned in advance for what that would look like beside other spines. So that might be.
Can you show us a couple of the interior art pieces? That's another thing I'd like to talk about on the show a little bit more often as I have more guests on, is like books as a way of keeping things that we're fond of, like pieces of art and things around. Yeah, go ahead and show the pictures.
Yeah.
I'll pick
Well,
up
here's
on this.
one.
Oh
I'm
wow.
not sure.
Okay. I can see a guy in a helmet, and looks like he's mid battle.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
really tightly cropped, almost a high emotion scene.
Yeah. Here's a couple of suspicious coins that they've found partway through the book. So it's a guy holding.
Are you working in charcoals?
No, this is white and black pencil on gray paper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It tends to look like charcoal until you know what I'm using. Here's their spooky high priest.
It really has almost. There's photorealism, but it has almost like the oil painterly quality to it. I know it's an illustration.
This illustration is based, and you wouldn't necessarily know it unless you knew the painting and also knew that I did this. It's based on Bellini's painting of Doge Loredan of Venice.
I think it was Steve showed your book.
Yeah,
and we flipped through and looked through the illustrations.
Yeah, I had no idea.
I said you're going to be everyone's hero for having these.
I got the Spiffbo related books that I have out just in case I got an opportunity to plug somebody else's books in the course of this.
So, well, we got a little bit of time here. Why don't you hold them up and show them to us?
Sure.
Spiffbo do we have?
I've got Edgar and the Flyboys.
And there's Edgar Allan Poe on the cover. Louise Gordon.
Yeah, and it's got such a great premise, and the prose. I haven't read it yet, but I've read a few pages, and the prose is really solid. It's about the guy who's supposed to. He's an immortal who's supposed to deliver Edgar Allan Poe to the afterlife, but gives him like a few extra days to finish his masterpiece, and then Edgar Allan Poe completely screws him over by taking several hundred years. And there's all kinds of celestial hijinks that ensue. So there's that, and this isn't a competition book, but I've got Philip Chase's The Way of Edan, the first of his Edan trilogy, and he's one of the judges, and he did a really generous thing. He gave up his chance to enter the competition with this in order to be one of the judges for the competition. And I've heard great things about this, and I've read a little bit, and the writing.
I love the cover on that. It's got a stained glass quality to it.
Yes, yeah. So those are the two Spiffbo-related hard copies that I have so far, and I cannot afford all the ones that I want.
I know.
Yeah,
the Poe thing's really cool. I love books that are fantasy books that involve real life historical figures. I forget the name of the author, but the Riverworld novels.
Oh yeah, Philip Jose Farmer.
Philip Jose Farmer. Reincarnates all of these historical figures. I mean, the reviews of the book are all over the place. There's some weird stuff in there. Not everyone liked it, but it was just so funny for me to see Samuel Clemens brought back to life.
Yeah, that's the first one of them. To Your Scattered Bodies Go. Which is the only one I ever read, because I actually didn't like it all that much. I liked some of his other books, but I didn't like that one that much. So
that one doesn't have.
I never read the others.
That one doesn't have Mark Twain in it. Actually, that one's a different main character. I think Mark Twain shows up in book 2, and by book 3, he has a riverboat with a laser strapped to the deck.
Cool. Yeah, this is Richard Francis Burton.
Yeah, that's right. Weird concept.
Ago. That's weird. It's a very strange book. Yeah.
He's a strange writer. I stuck with it. I finished the whole thing, but it got weirder and weirder. And there's some of their characters were like Neanderthals and earlier races of humanoid that we didn't know about, that he may or may not have invented for the books.
Does he ever tell you what's going on with Riverworld? Like, does he get around to?
In great detail, yeah.
Yeah, I really liked those stories in Strange Relations. So that was why I picked up the Riverworld books. But this is like when I was like 15.
So back when I first started publishing and was young and naive, I sent a copy of my poetry to Leonard Nimoy because I had heard that Leonard Nimoy was a fan of poetry. And I never heard back from him. But do you ever wonder if there's a chance that your books could have wound up on some bookshelf of a person you admire or another writer, or do you like to fantasize that your books are sitting in a library somewhere alongside your favorite fantasy author's books? Anything
Yes.
like that come to mind?
Yes.
And tell me about it.
Okay, so I would this is something that is much more developed with regard to my art because I've been doing that longer. But I feel like with art, you're either going to wind up in a thrift store or a museum over time. And part of your job while you're alive is to optimize your chances of it being a museum. So I've put a lot of work into that, and I'm in a bunch of museums. I have work scattered among collectors all over the world. So any local cataclysm will not destroy everything I ever did.
That's really cool.
I feel that. Thanks. I feel that way about the writing as well. I'm not, to my knowledge, in any libraries yet, but I'm working on it. I'm in very few bookstores, but I just published my book in June, and I don't have a name as an author of fiction yet, but I'm working on it. I really want my work to survive. There are a few people who have inspired me, to whom I would be so happy to give work back. Unfortunately, like Kubrick was one of them, and I will never have the chance to give anything to Kubrick. But I'm working on Terry Gilliam because I am a huge fan of his, and I've had the good fortune to be in touch with a few authors whom I admire a great deal, and most of the time when you try that sort of thing, nothing comes of it. But once in a while, something does come of it, and that's just awesome. You wind up getting to communicate a little bit with people who've made a difference in your life as a person and as a person who makes things, and that's like an incredible joy and privilege. So yeah.
Good answer. I do find the longer I'm in this, and not just in, because I've done a little art as well, not at the level that you're doing art, but I have done the markets and the galleries and things like that. It does feel like sometimes when you're talking to someone who's really well established, you want to give them something to show your gratitude and appreciation for what you do, but you don't want to push your stuff on them either. It almost feels like an imposition. So that's probably why I wouldn't do that now. I wouldn't just send someone my books, but I do want them to find their way there, somehow. I like to fantasize that the books will find their way there. And I thought
that would be
my
awesome.
first guest, W.D. Kilpack, he had a really great story because his one of the authors he looked up to while they were talking pulled his books up on his tablet and bought the books for himself. So
that was a good story.
He didn't even push them onto the guy. He requested them. That's even cooler.
Yeah, that was really cool. No, I was like, I can't imagine any author not having a feeling like that, and hopefully, eventually, a few good stories about it too.
Of the books that you have hanging around, are there any that have been particularly influential while you're writing the book that is in SPIFBO or whatever you're working on now, that because you keep them nearby and you see them every day, may have influenced you one way or the other to change or reconsider what you're writing or the way you present it or where the story goes?
I'm a huge fan of China Mieville.
Okay.
So I've got a bunch of his books, and I've thought about prose in relation to his books a lot over time. I'm looking at the books behind me on the screen. That first Hyperion novel blew me away, and that was a decently large influence because it showed that you could work a large scale narrative around completely, non-linear imagery. The stuff that doesn't really make any sense. It's just obviously a lot of that is simply inspired. Like the root layout of Omar Khayyam, it came out of him. And any attempt to explain it in the later books was nowhere near as successful as creating it in the first place. But the second book is actually weird novel called The Invention of Morel. And I haven't watched Last Year at Marienbad, but apparently that's partly based on it. And it's a very spooky book about an island with what appears to be time distortion on it. And it got blurbed by, I think, George Louis Borges, which is a pretty cool blurb to have.
I'm so distractible, especially when people are telling me about interesting books that I didn't know existed. I've been so distracted by your bookshelf, I forgot to ask you for a deeper dive into your actual series.
It starts in the middle of a very long war between adjacent Bronze Age city-states called, apparently somewhat confusingly, Florence and Genoa, because they have nothing to do with the actual Florence and Genoa. And there's an almost supernaturally intense storm, stops the fighting for a little bit, and when it clears, a woman in a golden chariot falls out of the sky. And it turns out that she is has fallen victim to an error in her own technology. She's from a very advanced city-state called Zanzibar that no one's ever heard of. And she built a thing for folding time and space, and it didn't work right. She wound up in the middle of this battle. So before they can get going again, she interferes, and she manages to resolve this long-standing war, and they vow to get her home. And the rest of the book is the very beginning of a massive project to get her back to this place that is thousands of miles and years away. And it involves the radical transformations that take place in Florence as a result of the end of the war and her introduction into the city. And the cast is her and one particular soldier who helped her out a lot at the beginning, and the king and the high priest, and several different individuals who are trying to seize the throne now that the war has ended and it's destabilized politics inside the city. And there's a metaphysically tall tower as well.
Metaphysically tall tower.
Yeah, there's
a tower that no one can tell how tall it is? Is it taller on the inside than the outside, or is it just infinitely tall?
Okay. It's taller on the inside, and whether or not it's infinite depends on the path that you take through it. So I really like the tower. The tower is a lot of fun.
That reminds me of a sword in the first Dresden Files book. Someone draws a sword that's infinitely long, and
oh, cool!
I heard infinitely long, like they're swinging it and it's infinite off into the sky. I may have misinterpreted it because it never came up again, and the next time they talked about the sword, it wasn't infinitely long. But I swear there was an infinitely long sword in that book. But
if it's not in there, you should use it.
Yeah, I should. It was one of those things that's just so preposterous that I don't even know how that would work. So why not say it and let the reader figure it out?
Right. Yeah.
Tell me, well, it's really interesting that you bring up all these time books, and then your book is a book that involves folding space and time, and not just, you throw it out there so casually, like this is old hat for you.
I have a metaphysical bent. So to the extent that I'm going to write fantasy, it's going to involve like alteration in, I guess, the nature of reality, and particularly time. Like I have like a lot of questions about the nature of time. And so it's fun to write characters who can interact with it experimentally. And it's not like standard time travel where, you go back and you change something. There's a lot of stuff about the like fine-grained structure of time and things that can be done once you like are interacting with time at a granular level, that kind of thing.
It makes sense because when we read a book, we're having a conversation with someone from the past.
Mm-hmm.
And vice versa as a writer.
It's incredible that you can do that.
I should wrap this up. We're approaching the limit of our show, at least in this timeline. So Daniel, thank you for coming on. Thanks everyone for listening. Daniel, will you tell us your website? And I'd like to remind everyone that the links to Daniel's books and website and everything else, and possibly your art, will be in the show notes below.
Sure. For finding author-related stuff, probably best is Instagram, Daniel Maidman _author. My website, which I have not yet updated to include my life as a fantasy writer, is danielmaidman.com. Anyway, thank you. It's been great chatting. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. All right. Thanks for watching the show, and keep your bookshelves dry.